Hi, it's time for another verb of the day. Today's verb is refuse. Let's take a moment to look at some of the definitions or the ways that you'll hear this verb used. The first way you might hear it used is to mean to indicate or show that one is not willing to do something. This verb was recently part of a lesson in one of my classes, and I have many parents with young children in my class, in this particular class, and we came up with the example of a child saying they will not do or they will not eat a particular food. And many parents had a number of examples of their children indicating or saying or showing them that they were not willing to do something. Another example or way that we use this verb refuse is to mean to indicate that one is not willing to accept something offered or to grant something that has been requested. So let's break this definition down into some parts here. So imagine I have a guest over to my home and I offer that person something to eat, something to drink, and they go, no, thank you, no, thank you, right? So they have not accepted something I offered them. Okay? In a second part of this, or another situation, right? If I ask someone for something, so maybe I'm asking my boss, my supervisor, for a particular day off, right? They go, no, right? They are not willing to accept my request. Then we could use this verb to also describe that action. A third way refuse gets used is to mean to fail to perform a required action. So sometimes, as you read reports of events, particularly those maybe dealing with the police, where the police have given a certain command to a person and they do not do what has been asked of them to do, right? Again, we could use that verb refuse. A fourth way, and I would say much less common way to encounter this verb, would mean to decline to accept an offer of marriage from someone. So, if you're reading older literature, older stories, you might see some examples of this, but not likely to hear it used on a regular basis. You should know that the verb refuse is a regular verb. To make the progressive form of this verb, I'm going to drop the E because I have a word that ends in a vowel, a consonant, then an E. And I do that before I add the suffix ing. That makes refusing. To make the past tense and participle forms of this verb, I really just need to add the letter D since this verb already ends in an E. Now my base verb, refuse, ends in a voice sound. That's a Z sound, which I know can be confusing. We have the letter S here, but we're making a Z sound. And so when I go to make the past tense and participle forms of this verb, and when I go to pronounce them in particular, I'm just going to make a D sound. So I'm not adding an extra syllable as I say this, so it should sound like refused, refused. Okay? Now, there aren't any phrasal verbs that we need to study, so instead, we can focus on making some example sentences. And today we'll practice making our sample sentences in the simple past tense and the present perfect progressive. Let's start with the simple past tense. We use this verb tense to describe actions that are completed at some known point in the past. Now, you might see time signals. This could be a word like yesterday, a phrase like last week, or even a specific date in the past, indicating that this is a known point in the past. But those time signals are not in every simple past tense sentence. It might be implied as part of a conversation or as part of a longer passage. Uh, so, the nice thing though about making simple past tense sentences is that our structure is going to stay the same no matter what our subject is. So in the affirmative, I'm going to have my subject, and then I'm going to have my ed verb here. So an example of this: the drunk refused to leave the bar, and then the police arrived. So here, this is that idea of not doing something that someone has asked you to do, right? So maybe this person was bothering other customers, right? And they wanted that person to leave, would not agree, would not comply with that. Now, let's look at making a negative simple past tense sentence. To do this, I start with my subject, I use did not, and then the base verb. You might also see the contraction or hear the contraction didn't and then the base verb means the same thing. They're both great. An example of this might be the waiter didn't refuse the group. Right? So I know some people who've worked in this industry, they might see a large group and think, oh, I don't want to deal with that. I'm not going to be their server. But here, that didn't happen in this particular sentence. Now, let's look at making a yes or no question in the simple past tense. To do this, I start with did, then I'm going to have my subject, and then the base verb. So I always like pointing out to my students, notice the only time I'm using that ed form of the verb is in the affirmative. I use the base verb in my negative sentences and in my yes or no questions. So now that you've noticed that finer point, let's look at my yes or no example. Did the students refuse to do their work while the substitute was there? Right? They kind of say, I'm not studying. I'm not doing what you've asked me to do. Okay? I know I've been in some classes where the substitute has not been treated so well. So hopefully that doesn't happen in anyone's classes. Now let's talk about the present perfect progressive. We use this verb tense to talk about actions that have started in the past and are continuing into the present. I stress with my students present perfect progressive. The three P's there are going to help me remember I need three parts to make my verb. So I'm going to have my subject, then I will have or has. That's part one. Then I use the participle been, B-E-E-N, and then I use the ing form the verb. Now, some books and some teachers will call this the present perfect continuous, and that's great. That's fine. It means the same thing. My notes here again are to help some of my students who've heard me say again and again, three P's, three parts to my verb. So let's take a look at an affirmative example. The official has been refusing to resign her post for the last 2 weeks. Okay? So again, this goes back to that idea of like, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to do what you've asked me to do. So official here is singular. That's why you see has been and then the ing form of the verb. Let's take a look at a negative example. Again, our general structure is that we're going to have our subject, then have or has, then not, then been, and then the ing form the verb. Here's another example. I haven't been refusing any desserts, and boy, it's showing, right? So might be suggesting, oh, the clothes are getting a little tighter because I haven't said no thank you whenever someone has offered me a sweet treat. Now, let's look at making a yes or no question. To do this in the present perfect progressive, I start with have or has, whichever form matches my subject, and that subject comes next. Then we're going to have our participle been, and then the ing form the verb. Here's another example. Has the car been refusing to start in the cold weather? It's going to go back to that third definition about someone or something not doing or not performing a required action, right? So when we turn the ignition or press a button for those newer cars, right, we expect it to start. But if it doesn't, right, we can use this verb to describe that, refusing to start. Hope that doesn't happen to you. Now, let's take a moment to look at some words that are related to our verb refuse. The first word we're going to look at is the noun refusal. This could be the act or maybe one particular event or instance of refusing someone or something. It could also be the state of being refused. An example of this: the politician has continued her refusal to allow journalists to ask follow-up questions, right? This idea of like, I don't allow it. It's not going to be permitted. Okay. Now, another related word you might encounter is the adjective refusable. That suffix able, I encourage you to remember, kind of able to be or capable of being refused in this case. So an example of this might be, their last offer was quite refusable. Here, I had no problem saying, no, thank you, I'm not interested. Perhaps what was being offered was too low and the thing that was desired was too valuable. Okay? Now, we're going to speak about one more word today, and it's something that can be a little confusing. So we have a noun that is also spelled refuse, but the pronunciation is going to be just a little different. We're going to change the stress. We're going to put it on the first syllable now, and at the end of the word, we're going to make an S sound. Refuse, refuse. Okay? If you would encounter this word, refuse, and it's being used as a noun in a sentence, it's referring to trash, or it's referring to something that's so worthless you want to throw it away. Okay, let me give you an example of this. Let's collect the refuse and take it to the dumpster. Okay. Now, again, this is something that can be really confusing about English. I hope you can hear the difference between the verb refuse, refuse, and the noun refuse, refuse. Okay, you're more likely to encounter and hear the verb, but I always want my students to be prepared for other forms of the word, different pronunciations, things that can look a little bit weird. So thank you so much for watching today's video. I hope you have a great day.